A kindness in the storm. The storm hit like a tidal wave, sudden and unrelenting. The city, usually bustling with energy, now seemed quiet and deserted as people hurried to seek shelter from the darkening skies. As rain lashed against the glass of his office window, Daniel Turner, heir to the prestigious Turner Enterprises, gazed out at the city below, his thoughts miles away from the business dealings that had kept him occupied for hours. His sharp eyes focused on the streaks of water running down the glass, his mind consumed by the weight of responsibility that came with his family's legacy. The house he had grown up in, the mansion perched on the outskirts of the city, was an imposing fortress of marble, polished wood, and gold accents. It was beautiful but cold, much like the life he had led. Despite all his material wealth, Daniel's heart often felt a hollowness that money couldn't fill. His father, the successful entrepreneur and patriarch of the Turner family, had always been distant, his love measured in expectations and obligations. His mother, who had passed away when he was just a child, was nothing more than a faded memory, her face slowly blurring with time. Today, however, Daniel was feeling the strain of isolation more than usual. As the rain pounded against the city's skyline, he thought about the life he had built, one that left him with no real connection to anyone. Even his closest friends seemed to view him as nothing more than a means to an end, their interactions often focused on business or status. With a sigh, Daniel stood up, grabbing his coat and leaving his office. His thoughts drifted to the mansion, and how much he longed for something more than just the endless cycle of wealth and privilege. Maybe tonight, he would find a way to escape it all, if only for a few hours. He made his way down the grand staircase of his building, nodding politely to the staff as he walked toward the exit. His driver, Edward, was already waiting in the car, his expression one of practiced professionalism. Daniel didn't have the energy for small talk, so he settled into the back seat, letting the silence between them stretch as they made their way toward the mansion. The rain intensified as they drove, and the normally familiar route seemed more oppressive in the storm. The streets were nearly empty, save for the occasional car or pedestrian hurrying along. Then, something caught Daniel's eye. At the edge of the sidewalk, half hidden in the shadows, a figure moved erratically. The hunched shape of a woman, drenched to the bone, was staggering along the road, her steps unsteady as the wind pushed her in all directions. Her ragged clothes clung to her thin body, and she appeared to be struggling against the elements just to stay upright. It wasn't a common sight in this part of the city. The rain and the storm had driven everyone indoors. And yet here she was, exposed to the worst of it. Daniel's instinct kicked in. Though his life had been defined by privilege and convenience, there was something about the image of this woman, so vulnerable in the midst of a violent storm, that stirred a deep empathy within him. The world outside his glass and steel tower often felt distant, but the sight of her brought something real and human into focus. For a moment, he didn't see a beggar, a homeless woman, or even a stranger. He saw someone in need. He ordered Edward to stop the car, rolling down the window to peer out into the downpour. "Hey," Daniel called through the storm, his voice barely audible against the roar of the wind. "Are you all right?" The woman turned toward him, her face hidden beneath the soaked strands of dark hair. For a moment, she just stared at him, her expression unreadable. Her eyes were wide and tired, as though she had been walking for hours, maybe days. Despite the distance, Daniel could see the desperation in her eyes, the flicker of hope that perhaps someone had noticed her plight. "Come on, get in," Daniel urged, his tone firm but gentle. "You're not going to make it out here in this storm. I'll take you to my place. You'll be safe there." The woman hesitated, clearly unsure of his motives. People didn't often offer help to strangers, and even fewer people would invite a soaking wet homeless woman into their mansion. But something about his sincerity seemed to break through the walls she had built around herself. With a weak nod, she approached the car, and Daniel opened the door for her, offering a hand to help her inside. As she climbed in, her body trembling with cold, Daniel could see just how fragile she was. The rain had drenched her to the core, her clothes clinging to her skin. She was clearly exhausted, both physically and emotionally, as though she had been running from something for a long time. "Thank you," she whispered as she sank into the seat, the warmth of the car a welcome relief from the icy chill that had gripped her. Her voice was raspy, a result of the cold and possibly the exhaustion that had taken over her. "No need to thank me," Daniel replied softly, pulling the car away from the curb. "Just get some rest. We're almost there." The drive to the mansion felt long, though it was only a few miles. The storm showed no signs of letting up. The roads slick with rain, the trees bending under the force of the wind. The silence between them was comfortable, even though Daniel felt the weight of the unknown hanging in the air. He didn't know why he had felt compelled to stop for this woman, but there was something about her that felt familiar. Her presence made him uneasy in a way that he couldn't explain, as though something from the past was calling to him. But that thought was pushed aside when he glanced at her again and noticed her fragile state. When they finally reached the mansion, Daniel helped her out of the car, guiding her through the grand front doors. The lavish hallways stretched ahead of them, lined with intricate paintings, rich tapestries, and polished marble floors. Despite the luxury of the surroundings, there was something starkly empty about the place. The grand chandelier above them flickered in the dim light, casting shadows across the walls. "Come on in," Daniel said, leading her to the sitting area by the fireplace. "Get warm. I'll grab you a blanket." Margaret, for that was the woman's name, looked around in awe. Her eyes took in the ornate decorations, the opulent furniture, and the quiet beauty of the mansion. She had never been inside such a place before, and yet, as she took it all in, there was a strange feeling bubbling up inside her, a feeling she couldn't place. The room, the furniture, the soft crackling of the fire, something about it felt familiar, unsettlingly so. Daniel returned with a blanket, draping it over her shoulders. He offered her a cup of tea, his eyes searching her face. There was something about her, something that tugged at his memory, but he couldn't figure out why. He had seen so many faces, so many people, but none like hers. Her sadness seemed to seep into the air around them, and Daniel found himself wanting to do more than just offer temporary comfort. He wanted to understand. "Is there anything I can do?" he asked, settling across from her. His voice was soft, as if not wanting to break the fragile moment that had passed between them. Margaret looked up at him, her eyes haunted yet grateful. "Just let me stay for a while, until the storm passes." Daniel nodded, but deep down, he felt that this was no ordinary encounter. It was as if fate had woven their paths together for a reason, and he had no idea just how much his life would change in the days to come. The unexpected connection. The warmth of the mansion was a welcome contrast to the icy chill Margaret had endured outside. As she sat by the fire, wrapped in the thick, plush blanket Daniel had provided, her body slowly began to thaw. The fire crackled softly, its glow casting a golden hue across the room, and for the first time in what felt like ages, Margaret allowed herself to relax. She closed her eyes, letting the heat seep into her bones. The exhaustion she had been carrying for so long felt lighter here, and her guard, so carefully built over the years, started to slip. Yet, a quiet unease lingered at the back of her mind, like a whisper she couldn't quite understand. Daniel watched her from across the room, his gaze soft but alert. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this woman than met the eye. She wasn't just a random stranger he had taken pity on. No, there was an inexplicable connection between them, something that felt rooted in the past. He watched the way her eyes darted around the room, almost searching for something, and the slight tremble in her hands as she held the mug of tea. "Are you okay?" Daniel asked gently, breaking the silence that had settled between them. His voice was tender, but there was an underlying tension, as though he was walking on thin ice, afraid of shattering the fragile trust between them. Margaret nodded but didn't look at him. Her gaze was fixed on the flickering flames. "I'm fine. Just tired," I guess. It's been a long time since I've been this warm. Daniel studied her closely. There was something in her tone. An exhaustion that went beyond the physical. She had the look of someone who had been running from something for a long time. Someone who had experienced more pain than any one person should. It troubled him. This sense that she was hiding a much deeper story. I get it, Daniel said, his voice softer now, as he leaned forward in his chair. This place can be a bit overwhelming sometimes. I've lived here most of my life. But it still feels lonely. He hadn't meant to admit that, but the words escaped before he could stop them. A silence hung between them, thick with the weight of his confession. Margaret finally turned her eyes to him, her expression unreadable. Lonely, you say? Her lips curled into a faint, almost sad smile. What does it matter how big the house is, how grand the furniture, when you're alone? Daniel blinked, startled by the bitterness in her words. She wasn't just talking about loneliness. She was speaking from experience. There was a depth in her eyes, a quiet understanding that made him feel as though she knew exactly what it was like to live in a gilded cage, surrounded by riches but devoid of true connection. Before he could respond, Margaret looked down at her hands, her fingers tracing the edge of the mug, as if trying to ground herself in the moment. She hesitated for a long while, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. You don't know what it's like, do you? To lose everything you ever loved, to have nothing but the clothes on your back, and a name that means nothing. Daniel's throat tightened at the vulnerability in her words. His privileged upbringing had kept him sheltered from such pain. He had never truly known loss, not the way she seemed to. He had never had to fight for survival, for even a single meal. Everything had always been provided for him, until now. Margaret, Daniel said, his voice filled with compassion. You don't have to tell me if you're not ready, but I want to understand. Why were you out there, in the storm? What's your story? Margaret's eyes flickered with uncertainty, but then she let out a long, shaky breath. The pain in her eyes was raw, but so was the need to be heard. She had carried this weight for so long that it was starting to suffocate her. Perhaps, just perhaps, Daniel might be the one person who would listen without judgment. She set the mug down on the side table and leaned back in her chair, gazing at the fire. Her voice was steady, but there was a tremor in the quiet spaces between her words. I wasn't always like this, she began, her eyes far away as memories surged forward. Once I had everything. A family, a home. I was loved. I thought. Her voice faltered, and she swallowed hard. But then everything changed. I was married to a man who promised me the world, and for a while, he gave it to me. But then, the lies started. The betrayal, the secrets. Daniel remained silent, his heart aching at the rawness in her voice. He could hear the echoes of her pain in every word. It was a pain that ran deeper than surface scars, deeper than any wound he could imagine. He took everything from me, Margaret continued, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. My trust, my dignity, and my son. I don't even know how it happened. One moment, I was living the life I dreamed of, and the next, I was abandoned, penniless, with no way to fight back. She paused, her eyes flicking toward Daniel. My son, he was taken from me, and I've spent every day since searching for him. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of her grief. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The woman sitting across from him was not just a beggar, not just a homeless stranger in the storm. She was a mother who had lost everything. And yet, here she was, still clinging to the hope that one day, somehow, she would be reunited with the child she had been torn from. Daniel's mind raced, and his heart thundered in his chest. He didn't know why, but the way she spoke of her son stirred something inside him. The connection between them, that nagging feeling that had been building since the moment she stepped into the mansion, seemed more than just a coincidence now. I'm sorry, Daniel murmured, his voice full of empathy. I can't imagine what you've been through. But you said you've been searching for your son. Who is he? Where did you last see him? Margaret hesitated, and for a moment she looked as though she might withdraw into herself. But then she met his gaze, her eyes filled with both sorrow and a desperate glimmer of hope. "His name is Ivan. He would be around your age now. But when I last saw him, he was just a baby. I had to leave him behind to protect him, and I've been trying to find him ever since." Daniel felt his heart skip a beat. The name, Ivan, struck him with an uncanny familiarity. He didn't know why, but it felt like a name he should know. Something deep inside him stirred, a feeling that this woman's son, this Ivan, was somehow connected to him. But how? Before he could voice his thoughts, the sound of footsteps echoed through the hall. It was Thomas, the family's longtime guardian, appearing in the doorway with his stern, calculating gaze fixed on Daniel and Margaret. "Is everything all right?" Thomas asked, his voice measured, though there was a hint of suspicion in his eyes. Thomas had always been wary of strangers, especially when they entered the Turner household. And this woman, this mysterious Margaret, was no exception. Daniel glanced at Margaret, who looked uncomfortable under Thomas's scrutiny. "Yes, Thomas, everything's fine. I'm getting to know Margaret," Daniel replied, his voice firm but not unkind. "She's had a hard time. I'm helping her." Thomas's eyes narrowed slightly, his mistrust palpable. "Helping her? You're sure she's not here for something else?" Margaret stiffened, her hands trembling slightly. "I'm not here to cause trouble," she said quietly, her voice soft but defensive. "I just need a place to rest, and for someone to listen." Thomas didn't reply immediately, but his gaze flicked between the two of them, his suspicion growing. "I'll be in my study if you need me," he said tersely before turning and walking away. As the door clicked shut behind him, Daniel turned back to Margaret, his eyes softening. He could feel the weight of Thomas's disapproval, but he didn't care. There was something about Margaret, something he couldn't quite explain, that drew him in. He would not let Thomas's suspicion dictate how he treated her. "I believe you," Daniel said quietly, his words firm and filled with the sincerity he rarely allowed himself to show. "And you don't have to explain everything right now. But know this, if you need help finding your son, I'll do whatever I can. We'll figure this out together." Margaret looked up at him, her eyes filled with unshed tears. For the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, fate had led her to this mansion, to Daniel Turner, for a reason. Secrets beneath the surface. The days that followed Margaret's arrival at the mansion passed in a blur of strange emotions and uncertain moments. The storm outside had finally subsided, but an unease lingered in the air, like the calm before another storm. Margaret had settled into a quiet routine in the mansion, and Daniel had kept his distance, not out of lack of interest, but because he was overwhelmed by the ever-growing mystery surrounding her. He had done his best to help her settle in, offering her food, fresh clothes, and comfort, but every time their paths crossed, he felt the pull of something deeper, something he couldn't yet understand. Margaret, for her part, remained distant, though she was undeniably grateful for his kindness. She kept to herself most of the time, only speaking when necessary, her eyes often lost in thought. But there was a sadness in her gaze, a weight that Daniel couldn't ignore. He wondered if she was keeping more secrets than she let on, secrets that she wasn't ready to share. He was willing to wait, though, knowing that the truth would eventually come to light, one way or another. One afternoon, as Daniel sat at the large dining table in the mansion's grand dining hall, he found himself staring at the family portrait hanging on the wall across from him. It was an old photograph, one that had been taken long before he had inherited the estate. His father, standing tall and proud, his mother with a gentle smile beside him, and Daniel himself, just a child, looking up at them with wide eyes. The portrait had always been a constant fixture in his life, but now, for some inexplicable reason, it seemed to mock him. There was something unsettling about the faces in the picture, something that felt distant and foreign, as if they were strangers he had never truly known. He was so absorbed in his thoughts that he didn't hear Margaret enter the room. Her soft footsteps were barely audible, and when she spoke, her voice caught him off guard. "Do you ever wonder who you really are?" Margaret's words were a quiet whisper, but they carried with them a weight that struck Daniel like a physical blow. He looked up at her, his eyes meeting hers for the first time in days. The question hung in the air, impossible to ignore. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice betraying a hint of confusion. He wasn't sure if she was referring to something personal or if it was just another one of her enigmatic comments. But as he watched her, something about her presence made his heart race, like she was trying to tell him something without actually saying it. Margaret paused for a long moment, her eyes drifting to the portrait on the wall. "I don't know. Maybe it's just that sometimes I feel like we're all playing roles. Like we're acting out a script that was written for us long before we even realized it." Her gaze seemed far away, as if she was looking through him and not at him. Daniel frowned, standing up from his chair and walking over to where she stood. "What do you mean by that? Are you saying that's how you feel? Like you're pretending to be someone you're not?" Margaret turned toward him, and for a brief moment, their eyes locked. She said nothing, but the silence between them was loaded with meaning. The words she had spoken, though cryptic, resonated with Daniel on a deep level. There was a vulnerability in her voice that spoke to something inside him, a feeling he couldn't quite articulate but had been slowly creeping into his thoughts for days. It was the feeling that everything he had known, everything he had been taught about his family, his life, might not be what it seemed. Before he could press her further, there was a soft knock on the door. They both turned toward it, and before Daniel could answer, Thomas entered, his expression as stern and unyielding as ever. He seemed to appear out of nowhere, always keeping a close eye on everything that happened within the mansion. "Mr. Turner," Thomas began, his voice cold and efficient, "I need to speak with you in private." Daniel exchanged a glance with Margaret, who looked suddenly uncomfortable. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, clearly uneasy with Thomas's presence. But Daniel, not wanting to dismiss her so abruptly, gave her a reassuring smile. "It's okay, Margaret," Daniel said, his voice gentle. "I'll be back in a moment. Please, make yourself comfortable." Margaret nodded stiffly and left the room without another word, her footsteps echoing in the vast hallway as she disappeared into the distance. Once she was gone, Daniel turned to face Thomas, who was already glaring at him with barely concealed disapproval. The older man had always been protective of the family's wealth, its reputation, and its legacy. But lately, Daniel had noticed a growing tension between them. Thomas was becoming more and more suspicious of his decisions, especially his decision to bring Margaret into the fold. "What's going on, Thomas?" Daniel asked, his voice calm but edged with frustration. "Why are you so worried about Margaret? She's just here to rest. I don't understand why you're making this such a big deal." Thomas's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, he seemed almost wary of speaking. But he had never been one to hold back his thoughts, and after a long pause, he finally spoke. "There's something off about her, Mr. Turner," Thomas said in a low voice. "I've been keeping an eye on her, and I'm telling you, she's hiding something. She's not here by chance. Her arrival, it's too coincidental." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" Thomas leaned in closer, lowering his voice further. "I've been doing some research, Mr. Turner. This woman, Margaret, she's not just some random homeless woman. Her name doesn't match any public records, and there's something strange about her background. It's almost as if she's erased parts of her past on purpose." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about? Are you saying she's lying?" Thomas shook his head. "I'm not saying she's lying, but there's something in her eyes, Mr. Turner, something she's not telling you. And I believe she's connected to this family, your family, in a way that no one, not even you, realizes." Daniel recoiled at Thomas's words. "What are you implying?" Thomas hesitated, but then his voice softened. "I don't know yet, but I have a bad feeling about all of this. The past always catches up with you, no matter how hard you try to bury it. Before Daniel could respond, Thomas turned and walked out of the room, leaving Daniel alone with his racing thoughts. The room felt colder now, the shadows longer, and Daniel couldn't shake the growing sense of unease that was creeping over him. He knew Thomas was protective, but this felt different. He had always trusted Thomas, had always relied on his judgment. But now he wasn't so sure. With a heavy sigh, Daniel sat back down at the dining table, his mind a whirlwind of questions. What was Thomas trying to warn him about? What did Margaret know that she wasn't telling him? As the hours passed, Daniel found himself growing more and more restless. The mansion, once a place of comfort and familiarity, now felt like a maze of hidden truths. And Margaret, this mysterious woman, was at the center of it all. She had come into his life for a reason, but what that reason was, he had no idea. And as much as he wanted to help her, the growing suspicion that she was hiding something made him hesitate. And then, as if on cue, Margaret appeared in the doorway again, her figure framed by the dim light of the hallway. She looked at him with an unreadable expression. And for a moment, it felt as if time itself had stopped. "I think it's time I tell you everything," Margaret said quietly, her voice steady, but filled with an emotion Daniel couldn't place. "The ties that bind." The words hung in the air between them, thick with anticipation. Daniel stood motionless, his hands gripping the edge of the dining table as he watched Margaret. Her expression had shifted, no longer guarded but instead open, vulnerable. There was an intensity in her eyes now, as though she had finally decided to reveal the truth, no matter how painful. "I think it's time I tell you everything," Margaret repeated, her voice steady, but tinged with an emotion Daniel couldn't quite decipher. Daniel nodded, a strange sense of urgency rising within him. He had been waiting for this moment, though he had no idea what to expect. There was something in his gut, a gnawing feeling, telling him that the truth would change everything. He gestured toward the chair across from him. "Please, I'm listening." Margaret hesitated for a moment, as though weighing her words carefully. She had spent so many years burying her past, hiding from the truths that were far too painful to confront. But in this moment, with Daniel's steady gaze upon her, she realized that keeping the secrets any longer would only cause more damage. She needed to tell him, even if it meant her world would fall apart. She sat down slowly, her hands trembling slightly. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, and then began, her voice barely above a whisper. "My name is Margaret Turner," she said, her eyes meeting his. "And I am your mother." The words landed with the force of a thunderclap. Daniel's breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, the world seemed to shift beneath his feet. His heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing to process what he had just heard. Margaret Turner, his mother. But that couldn't be possible. His mother had died years ago, hadn't she? He had seen her funeral. He had grieved for her. How could this woman possibly be his mother? Margaret saw the confusion and disbelief on Daniel's face, and she quickly held up her hands in a gesture of peace. "I know this is hard to believe," she said, her voice full of sadness. "I know it doesn't make sense. But I am your mother, Daniel, and I've been looking for you for so long." Daniel took a step back, his mind struggling to catch up. He could feel his pulse in his ears, his body reacting instinctively to the shock. This couldn't be real. There was no way this woman, a stranger to him in every way, could be his mother. But the way she spoke, the pain in her eyes, it was enough to make him question everything he thought he knew. "Why didn't you tell me this sooner?" Daniel finally managed to ask, his voice hoarse with disbelief. "Why wait until now?" Margaret's eyes softened, but there was a deep sorrow behind them. "Because I was forced to leave you, and when I did, I couldn't protect you anymore." Daniel's confusion deepened. "What are you talking about? Forced to leave me? I don't understand." Margaret's gaze dropped to the floor, her fingers twisting the fabric of her sweater as she gathered her thoughts. She could see that Daniel was struggling to grasp the enormity of what she was saying. She didn't blame him. It was a lot to take in, especially for someone who had grown up without her. "I was married to your father," Margaret began slowly, her voice trembling. "He was a man of power, of influence, but he wasn't the man you thought he was. He had secrets, dangerous secrets. And one of those secrets was that he was involved in something far darker than I could ever imagine. I didn't know until it was too late." Daniel was silent, his heart pounding in his chest. His father had always been the epitome of strength in his eyes, the man who had provided for their family, the man who had taught him everything. But now, hearing his mother speak of him in this way, Daniel felt as though the foundation of his entire life had just cracked wide open. "He threatened to take you from me," Margaret continued, her voice breaking. "When I found out what he was really involved in, I confronted him. I tried to leave with you, but he wouldn't let me. He said he would destroy me if I tried to take you away. So I had to make the hardest decision of my life. I left you behind, to protect you. I thought that if I disappeared, he would think I had given up and leave us both alone." Tears welled in Margaret's eyes, and Daniel felt his own throat tighten. This was too much. His entire life, his memories of his parents, everything he thought he knew about his family was being called into question. "But why didn't you come back for me?" Daniel asked, his voice full of anguish. "Why didn't you ever try to find me?" Margaret's eyes were filled with regret as she looked at him. "I tried. I spent years searching for you, Daniel. I tried to track you down, but I had no resources, no connections. Your father made sure that I had nothing. I couldn't reach out to anyone without risking my life. And when I finally thought I was getting close, I lost everything." Daniel's mind spun. His father, a man he had admired and looked up to, was not the man he had believed him to be. The secrets, the lies, everything seemed so much bigger than anything he had ever imagined. And now, here was this woman, claiming to be his mother, telling him that the person he had trusted most had kept him from knowing the truth. Daniel sat down, his legs suddenly feeling weak beneath him. He looked at Margaret, his mind still trying to process everything. "I don't know what to say." Margaret's eyes filled with sorrow. She reached out, gently placing her hand on his. "I don't expect you to understand, Daniel. I don't expect you to forgive me, not yet. But I want you to know that I never wanted to leave you. I never wanted to be apart from you." The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Daniel's mind was a whirlwind of emotions, rage, confusion, disbelief. His entire life had been a lie, and now, here in front of him, was the woman who had been taken from him. But more than that, she was the key to understanding a much larger mystery, one that was far darker and more dangerous than he could ever have anticipated. As he sat there, his thoughts racing, he realized something else. The truth was far from over. There were still so many unanswered questions, and the deeper he dug, the more he feared what he might find. Why had his father been involved in such dangerous activities? What was it that Margaret had discovered? And why had fate brought her back into his life now, of all times? But there was one thing that Daniel knew for sure. His world, the world he thought he understood, was about to change forever. And whatever lay ahead, he wasn't going to face it alone. Margaret looked at him, her expression one of both sorrow and hope. "I know this is a lot to take in, Daniel, but I'm not asking you to forgive me today. I'm asking you to trust me. We have a lot to uncover together." Daniel didn't answer immediately. He couldn't, not yet. But deep inside, a part of him knew that she was right. The past had a way of coming back when you least expected it, and the truth was something that had to be faced, no matter how painful. And for better or for worse, he would face it, with her. Unraveling the past. The days that followed the shocking revelation were a blur of overwhelming emotions. Daniel found himself caught between the need to understand what had happened and the dread of uncovering a past that was dark, filled with lies and betrayal. Margaret's confession weighed heavily on him, And as the hours stretched into days, he could feel the walls of his world crumbling around him. It wasn't just his perception of his parents that had shattered, but his entire understanding of who he was. Margaret had retreated into her own quiet corner of the mansion after their conversation, keeping her distance as if giving Daniel the space to process everything. Yet Daniel couldn't escape the pull of her words, the unsettling truth that his life had been shaped by forces beyond his comprehension. The man he had revered as his father, the man who had given him everything, was not the man he had imagined. And his mother, the woman he had thought was lost forever, was sitting in his house, living and breathing, with secrets of her own. Daniel spent hours wandering the mansion, lost in thought, trying to piece together fragments of memories and information that didn't quite make sense. The mansion, with all its grandeur, felt empty now. The luxury of its marble floors, the polished chandeliers, and the priceless artworks on the walls, none of it could fill the hollow ache in his chest. He had everything, and yet nothing at all. One evening, as he sat in the grand library of the mansion, a place he often sought refuge in, his eyes roamed across the shelves, searching for something to occupy his mind. His fingers brushed over the spines of books, but none of them seemed to offer any comfort. The stories within those pages paled in comparison to the real-life drama unfolding around him. As the last rays of the sun dipped below the horizon, he noticed something strange. A book, tucked away at the far end of the shelf, almost as if it had been deliberately hidden. Curiosity piqued. Daniel pulled the book from its place. It was an old leather-bound journal, its cover worn with age. He flipped it open and immediately recognized his father's handwriting, sharp and precise, yet filled with a tension that was hard to ignore. His father had kept journals throughout his life, documenting his business dealings, his thoughts, and his reflections on the world. But this one was different. This journal seemed personal, as if it were meant to be read by someone who wasn't supposed to see it. With a sense of trepidation, Daniel began to read. The first few pages contained the usual business notes, but then the tone shifted. It became darker, filled with words of paranoia, fear, and regret. Daniel's eyes widened as he read his father's admissions of guilt, admissions that were far worse than anything he had ever imagined. His father spoke of dangerous dealings with criminals, shady alliances, and threats that had been made against the family. But there was one entry, buried deep in the journal, that made Daniel's blood run cold. "Margaret knows too much. I can't allow her to destroy everything I've worked for. If she threatens my position, I'll do whatever it takes to keep her quiet. She's no longer my wife. She's a liability." Daniel's hands shook as he read the words again. His father had betrayed his mother, had actively tried to silence her. He had known the truth about her departure, about why she had left, and had manipulated the entire situation to protect his own interests. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. How could his father have been capable of such cruelty? How could the man he had admired have been a part of something so sinister? The next few pages only deepened his shock. There were references to a hidden network, a web of corruption that his father had been involved in, something that extended far beyond business dealings. But there were no specifics, no clear explanations. It was all vague, coded language, as if his father had been careful not to leave too much evidence behind. Daniel slammed the journal shut, his mind racing. His father had created a fortress of lies, one that had been carefully constructed to protect him at any cost. And now, here he was, standing in the ruins of that fortress, with nothing but questions and pain. He couldn't understand why his father had gone to such lengths to destroy their family, to tear apart everything that Daniel had believed in. Just then, he heard footsteps approaching. The door creaked open, and Margaret appeared, her expression a mixture of concern and apprehension. She had been giving him space, but she could sense that something had shifted within him, that he was on the verge of discovering something more. "Daniel," she asked softly, her voice gentle but filled with the weight of knowing that she had been a part of the story that was unfolding. "Are you all right?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he placed the journal down on the table in front of him and looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger, confusion, and disbelief. Margaret took a cautious step forward, her gaze lingering on the book. "Do you know what that is?" he asked, his voice tight. Margaret's face paled as she nodded slowly. "I suspected you might find it." "Why didn't you tell me, Margaret?" Daniel demanded, his voice trembling with emotion. "Why didn't you tell me the truth about what he was? About what he did to you?" Margaret's eyes filled with sorrow as she sat down across from him, her hands trembling slightly. "I didn't want you to know. I never wanted you to know the things he did. I tried to protect you, Daniel, the way a mother protects her child. But Daniel stopped himself, unable to finish the thought. The words were too much, too overwhelming. How could you stay with him? How could you let him do all of this? Margaret closed her eyes, her expression filled with regret. "I was trapped, Daniel. You don't understand. When I first met your father, he was charming, ambitious, a man who made promises about a future filled with greatness. But somewhere along the way, he changed. He became consumed by power, by greed. And when I tried to leave, when I tried to protect you from the darkness he had become, he made sure I couldn't. He made sure I had nothing." Daniel was silent for a long moment, his thoughts a jumbled mess. He wanted to lash out, to yell at her for not telling him sooner, but a part of him understood. She had done what she had thought was best, and now, the consequences of those decisions were coming to light. And yet he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more, so much more, that he didn't know. "And now?" he asked, his voice quieter. "What happens now?" Margaret looked at him, her expression full of resignation. "Now we face the truth together. But we're not alone, Daniel. There are others who know what your father was involved in. There are people out there who are looking for us, for you, and we can't hide from them forever." Daniel's stomach tightened. "Who are they?" Margaret stood up, her expression hardening. "I'll tell you everything, but we need to be careful. The past isn't done with us yet." As she spoke, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that their lives were about to spiral even further out of control. The past was knocking on their door, and the truth, no matter how painful, was something they could no longer escape. The final reckoning. The weight of the journal was still heavy in Daniel's hands as he stared at it, unwilling to let go. The words it contained were like a poison slowly seeping into his mind, and with every sentence, he felt a piece of his old life slipping away. His father, the man who had once been his hero, was a monster, a liar, a man whose power had been built on lies, deceit, and a ruthless thirst for control. But it wasn't just the revelations in the journal that troubled him. It was the truth that hung in the air, threatening to suffocate them both. "Do you remember anything from that night?" Margaret's voice broke through the suffocating silence. She had been standing by the door, waiting patiently for Daniel to process the journal, but the weight of the moment was too much for her to stand still. She knew they had no more time to waste. The danger was real now, and the more they waited, the more it would cost them. Daniel finally lifted his gaze to meet hers, his expression unreadable. "The night you left?" he asked, his voice distant, almost hollow. Margaret nodded, her eyes soft with regret. "Yes, the night I had to leave you. Do you remember it at all?" Daniel's mind flashed back to his childhood, a night etched in his memory for reasons he couldn't explain at the time. The storm, the confusion, the distant voices, and then the emptiness that followed. The pain of losing her was a wound he had carried all his life, but he had never known why it had happened. He only remembered the feeling of being abandoned, the confusion of waking up one morning to find that everything he had known was gone. "I remember waking up and you were gone. But I didn't understand," Daniel said slowly, his voice heavy with emotion. "I was just a kid. I thought you didn't want me anymore." Margaret closed the distance between them, her hand gently resting on his. "Oh, Daniel," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I never wanted to leave you. But your father, he made it impossible for me to stay. He didn't just threaten me, he threatened you. He promised me that if I tried to take you, he would destroy us both. I had no choice but to disappear, and even then, I knew I would never stop searching for you." Daniel's chest tightened, the pain of the past washing over him like a tidal wave. He could hardly breathe as the weight of her words settled in his heart. His entire life had been built on a lie his father had crafted to keep him in the dark, to keep him from knowing the truth. "But what was it, Margaret?" Daniel asked, his voice strained. What was he really involved in? What did he want? And why did he leave you with nothing? Margaret hesitated, her eyes flickering with something dark, something that Daniel had never seen in her before. She took a step back, pacing across the room as if searching for the right words. "He wasn't just a businessman, Daniel," she said quietly. "Your father was deeply involved in illegal activities, things that would have destroyed everything he built if the truth had come out. The people he was working with were dangerous, far more dangerous than I ever realized. And when I found out, he realized I had become a liability. He couldn't risk me knowing too much, or worse, talking about it. So he cut me out of your life. He erased me." Daniel stood frozen, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "How could I have been so blind?" he whispered, his voice shaking with a mix of anger and despair. "He destroyed everything. My whole life, my entire identity. It was all built on his lies." Margaret took a deep breath and looked at him, her eyes full of both sorrow and determination. "I know, Daniel, and I know how much it hurts. But there's more. There's something you need to understand, something that has to be dealt with before we can ever move forward." Daniel's brow furrowed, his mind reeling. "What are you talking about?" Margaret walked over to the window, her gaze drifting out into the darkening world outside. "There are people still looking for you, Daniel. People from your father's past. They know about you, about your connection to me. And they won't stop until they find you." Daniel felt his heart race, a sense of dread creeping over him like a shadow. "Who are they? What do they want?" Margaret turned to face him, her face hardening. "They're the ones your father worked for, the ones he was trying to protect by destroying everything. They're dangerous, Daniel, and they're not just after the truth. They want power, control, and they'll do whatever it takes to get it." The gravity of her words sank in, and Daniel could feel the ground beneath him beginning to shift. This was no longer just about family secrets or past betrayals. This was about survival. His father's empire of lies had extended far beyond the mansion, far beyond his own understanding. The people who had once been allies were now enemies, and those enemies were closing in. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Daniel's voice was strained with a mix of hurt and confusion. "Why didn't you tell me what we were facing?" Margaret's eyes softened as she took a step toward him. "I didn't want to involve you. I thought I could keep you safe, but now I realize I can't protect you from this alone. We have to face the truth together. We have to take down the people who want to destroy us." Daniel swallowed hard, his pulse quickening. He wasn't sure what he was more afraid of, the truth that was still hidden from him, or the terrifying people Margaret had spoken of. He had always felt like an outsider in his own life, but now, that feeling had become something far more ominous. There was a war waiting for him, a war he had never known existed. "Where do we even begin?" Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How do we stop them?" Margaret's expression hardened, determination flooding her veins. "We start by understanding the full extent of what your father was involved in. We need to expose everything, find the people who are pulling the strings, and we need to do it before they find us." Daniel nodded slowly, his mind already shifting into survival mode. He had no choice now. The past had finally caught up with him, and there was no turning back. He had to confront it, to face the terrifying truth, no matter what the cost. But deep down, a question still lingered in the back of his mind. Who could he trust? The world he had known was no longer the same. The safety he had once taken for granted was gone, replaced by the stark reality of a family legacy built on blood, secrets, and lies. And as Daniel looked at his mother, this woman who had been so distant yet so close, he realized that the only way forward was to take down the empire of deception his father had created. It wasn't just his future on the line anymore. It was the future of everyone he loved. Margaret's voice broke through his thoughts, her words steady and resolute. "We'll get through this together, Daniel. We've already lost too much to turn back now." And in that moment, Daniel knew she was right. The truth had been buried for too long, and now it was time to uncover everything. There was no other choice. The reckoning was coming, and it would be the most dangerous thing they had ever faced.